The night my daughter put me out of her house, I sat on the front step with a single suitcase and watched the porch light go off from the inside, and I thought about all the ways a person can be homeless without ever having been poor, all the ways a life can come apart at its seams in the specific quiet of a suburb at 10 o'clock at night while the neighbors' windows stay dark and the street stays empty and no one comes. I was 72 years old, and I had a suitcase, and I had the phone number of a woman from my church who had once told me I could call if I ever needed anything. And I had no idea whether that offer extended to this particular version of need, but I called her anyway because she was the only number I could think of, and she came and got me without asking a single question until we were inside her house and the kettle was on, and she looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Miriam, what happened?" And I told her. I told her the version I could tell at 10:30 at night after being put out of my own daughter's house, which was not the full version but was enough to explain the suitcase and the porch light going off and the way I was sitting in her kitchen unable to hold a full thought in my head for more than a few seconds before it scattered. My name is Miriam Cross, and I am 74 years old, and this is the story of the 2 worst years of my adult life and of the thing that happened at the end of them. That I would not have believed if someone had told it to me, that I still sometimes wake up at 4 in the morning and lie in the dark thinking about with the particular disbelief of a person who has been given something so specific and so impossible that the mind keeps returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not to hurt itself but to verify that it is real. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to subscribe right now, if you have not already, because this story is going to take time to tell correctly, and I need you to be here for the part that changes everything, the part that is not about loss, but about something I do not have a better word for, than grace, and I do not use that word lightly, and I do not use it often, and I mean it completely. Subscribe, hit the bell, stay with me. Let me take you back to the beginning. I had lived with my daughter Sandra and her husband Phil since I was 70 years old, which is to say I had lived with them for 2 years before the night of the porch light, 2 years that I had entered with hope and gratitude and the belief, genuinely held, that this arrangement was what family looked like when it was working the way it was supposed to work. My husband Nathaniel died when I was 68, and I was in the house we had shared for 31 years on Callaway Street in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the house was a 3-bedroom colonial that I had loved for all 31 of those years, and for the first year after Nathaniel died. I stayed in it and managed it and told myself and Sandra and my son David, who lives in Seattle, that I was fine, that I was managing, that I did not need to be monitored or relocated or transitioned, which is the word people use when they mean moved somewhere smaller and closer to where they can keep an eye on you. I was fine for most of that first year, and then I had a fall in the kitchen, nothing serious, a bruised hip and a wounded pride, and the particular indignity of lying on a kitchen floor for 20 minutes because I was not sure I could get up and was trying to decide whether to try, and when I finally got up and called Sandra. She was there within the hour, and she stayed for 3 days, and when she left, she brought me a medical alert button and a look on her face that I had been dreading for the better part of 2 years. The look that meant the conversation we had both been not having was going to be had now, whether I wanted it to or not. We had the conversation. It took 2 evenings and several phone calls with David, who was supportive in the particular way that people are supportive from 3,000 miles away, which is to say he was fully in favor of whatever Sandra decided and said so with great warmth and no specific involvement, and at the end of those conversations it was decided that I would sell the house on Callaway Street and move into Sandra's house, into the room that had been a home office and would become my room, and that this was the best solution for everyone, and that I would have my privacy and my independence, and that the arrangement was not permanent but transitional, which is a word that had started to feel, even then, like it was doing a great deal of heavy lifting. I want to be fair to Sandra in the way that I can only be fair to her now, from the distance of 2 years, and everything that happened after, because in the immediate aftermath of the porch light, I was not capable of fairness, and it would not have served either of us if I had tried. Sandra is my daughter, and she loves me, and the arrangement she proposed was proposed in good faith by a woman who was genuinely worried about her mother, and who had a house with a spare room, and who believed, I think, that the idea of living together would be easier in practice than it turned out to be. She did not anticipate how much space a person takes up when they are living in your house rather than visiting it. The way that presence becomes a kind of pressure over time. The way that two people's ideas about quiet and noise and order and schedule and the right way to load a dishwasher can become a low continuous friction that neither person acknowledges until it has been accumulating long enough to be impossible to ignore. I tried to take up as little space as possible. I tried, in the way that I had tried in certain other periods of my life, to need less than I needed and to ask for less than I wanted and to be grateful for what was offered rather than wishing for what was offered rather than wishing for what was not. And I managed this reasonably well for the first 6 months and less well after that. And progressively less well as the months continued and the friction accumulated and Sandra's patience, which was real but not infinite, wore toward the edge. The specific event that ended it was not dramatic, and I am not going to describe it in detail because Sandra is still my daughter and the specific event is not the point of the story. What the specific event was a version of a thing that had been happening between us for many months, a moment in which I said something in the way that I say things, directly and without enough cushioning, and Sandra said something back, and the exchange escalated in the way of exchanges that have been building for a long time and find in one particular moment enough oxygen to become a fire. She said she needed me to leave. I said she didn't mean that. She said she didn't. I sat she did. I sat on the front step with my suitcase. The porch light went off. I called the woman from my church. I lived with Margaret, the woman from my church, for 3 weeks, sleeping on her fold-out sofa and eating her meals and accepting her kindness with a gratitude I did not have words for, and a shame I also did not have words for, the specific shame of a 72-year-old woman who has been rendered dependent on the charity of a friend because her own family has determined they cannot accommodate her. David called twice and said he was looking into options and that he would help me figure something out and that he was sorry this had happened, and both calls were warm and both calls ended without a concrete plan, and I understood that looking into options meant looking into options for me from Seattle and that the looking might take some time. I was not bitter about this. I want to say that plainly because bitterness is the easy read and the easy read is not the accurate one. David had his own life and his own family, and I had made a choice 2 years earlier to move into Sandra's house rather than explore other options, and that choice, however it had been arrived at, was mine, and the consequences of it were also mine. I was 72 years old, and I had 3 weeks on a fold-out sofa and a son who was looking into options, and I was not bitter. I was frightened, which is a different thing. The specific fear of a person who has looked at the near future and found it less clear than they needed to be. Margaret found me a room in a senior residential community on the north side of Greensboro, a place called Birchview, which was clean and moderately priced and had other residents and a shared kitchen and a small garden and the specific institutional quality of a place designed for people whose circumstances require them to be somewhere and who have not yet determined where that somewhere will ultimately be. I moved in on a Tuesday in February with my suitcase and 3 boxes that Margaret helps me pack, and a particular determination not to treat this as an ending, because I had decided, in the 3 weeks on the fold-out sofa, that I was not going to treat anything as an ending until I had run out of alternatives, and I had not run out of alternatives. I was at Birchview for 11 weeks when I had the second fall. This one was worse. The kitchen in my room at Birchview had a step down to a small utility area that I had navigated successfully dozens of times and on this particular evening did not navigate successfully, and the result was a fracture, my wrist, hairline, but significant enough to require casting and a period of reduced independence that the management at Birchview determined was beyond what they could accommodate at the level of care I was receiving there. This is how I came to be at Greenbrook Rehabilitation and Extended Care, which is where everything in this story that is not the falling and the porch light and the fold-out sofa takes place. The first thing I noticed about Greenbrook was the quality of the light in the corridor outside my room, which came from a window at the far end and fell at an angle in the mornings that made the whole hallway feel less institutional than hallways in such facilities usually feel, and I registered. This is a small mercy and decided to be grateful for it, which is a decision I recommend to anyone in a situation where gratitude requires more effort than it usually does. The second thing I noticed about Greenbrook was the nurse. I do not want to rush past the first time I saw her because I think the telling requires me to be honest about what I noticed and when, which is that I noticed something immediately and did not understand what I was noticing, which is the way that certain kinds of recognition work, the ones that arrive before the conscious mind is caught up with what the deeper part of you has already registered. Her name was Diane. She was a registered nurse, mid-40s. The kind of woman who moves through a care facility with the specific combination of competence and warmth that tells you immediately that she has been doing this work for a long time and that the work has not worn her down but has, if anything, refined her, clarified something in her that was always there. She came into my room on my second day at Greenbrook to check my medication schedule and my cast and to ask me the particular questions that nurses ask when they are doing an assessment that is both clinical and personal. And I answered her questions, and she took her notes, and as she was leaving, she paused at the door and looked back and said, "Is there anything else you need right now, Mrs. Cross?" And I said, "No, thank you." And she said, "Okay." And then she stayed in the doorway for just a moment longer, not doing anything, just present, the way some people are present in a way that is different from occupying a space, and then she said goodnight and left. I lay in the bed in the light from the window, and I thought about the pause at the door, about what it had felt like, and I could not identify exactly what it had been, but I knew it had been something more than routine. And I filed it in the part of my mind where I keep things I do not yet understand. Over the following days, Diane was my primary nurse, and I had the opportunity to observe her with the other patients in my corridor, the way she talked to them and listened to them, and how she knew, without being told, which ones needed more time and which ones needed less, which ones wanted conversation and which ones wanted quiet and which ones, like Mrs. Patterson in room 7, needed someone to laugh with them in the specific way that laughter can be a form of medicine if you know how to use it. She was very good at her work, and she was very good with people in the particular way that goes beyond training, the way that comes from a person who has a genuine interest in the specific individual in front of them, rather than the general category of patient or resident or elderly person in need of care. She asked me about myself. Not the clinical questions, not the intake form questions about conditions and medications and emergency contacts, but the real questions. The questions that are really just an invitation to be a person rather than a patient, and I accepted the invitation because I am someone who talks, who has always talked, who believes that the telling of things is one of the ways we make sense of them. I told her about Nathaniel. I told her about the house on Callaway Street and the 31 years we had spent in it and what it had felt like to walk out of it for the last time with the sale papers signed and the keys handed over. I told her about David in Seattle and about Sandra and about the porch light and the fold-out sofa and Birchview and the step in the kitchen, and she listened to all of it with the same complete attention she brought to everything, asking a question occasionally, not to redirect but to understand, to fill in the shape of the thing I was telling her. And then one evening, maybe 10 days into my stay at Greenbrook, she came to do my evening check, and after she had done what she needed to do, she sat in the chair beside my bed, which was not standard procedure, but which felt, in the moment, like the most natural thing. And she looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, and she said, "Mrs. Cross, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that you don't have to answer and that whatever you tell me won't change anything about your care here or my relationship with you." I said, "All right." She said, "Were you ever in Greensboro in 1978? The room was very quiet. I heard the corridor outside, the distant sound of a television from one of the other rooms, the particular ambient sound of a building at night." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you give birth to a daughter in Greensboro in the spring of 1978? I want to tell you what happened in my body when she asked that question, not because I think the physical detail is the most important thing, but because I think it is the most honest description of what a moment like this actually does to a person, which is that it reorganizes everything. Simultaneously, the way an earthquake reorganizes a landscape so that the geography is the same, but every line and every distance and every relationship between one thing and another has shifted in ways you will spend a long time understanding. My hands were in my lap, and they went still. The rest of my body went still, too. I looked at Diane, and she looked at me in the years between 1978 and this room and this moment stacked up in the air between us. And I thought about a girl who was 24 years old and unmarried and working as a secretary at a law firm in Greensboro, and who found herself pregnant in a time and a set of circumstances that made the decision she made, the only decision that felt survivable, that felt like the least harm in a situation where harm was going to happen regardless. And I thought about the specific weight of that decision and the way it had lived in me for 50 years, not as regret exactly, because regret implies that a different choice was clearly available, and I do not believe it was, but as a presence, a permanent and particular awareness of an absence, the shape of someone who was not there. She had been the shape of someone who was not there for 50 years, and she was there. She was sitting in the chair beside my bed asking me whether I had given birth in Greensboro in the spring of 1978, and she was wearing her badge and her scrubs, and she had her father's coloring, which I had not let myself think about in decades, and she had something in her face that I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it, the specific thing that a person carries that makes them unmistakably and irreducibly themselves. And in her case, it was a quality of attention, a directness of gaze, a way of being completely present in a moment without apology or performance, and I knew it because I had looked at it in my own mirror for 72 years. I looked at Diane and she looked at me in the years between 1978 in this room and this moment stacked up in the air between us. And I thought about a girl who was 24 years old and unmarried and working as a secretary at a law firm in Greensboro, and who found herself pregnant in a time and a set of circumstances that made the decision she made, the only decision that felt survivable, that felt like the least harm in a situation where harm was going to happen regardless. I said, yes. She said, I was born in Greensboro in April of 1978 and I was adopted, and the records I was finally able to access 3 years ago list my birth mother's name as Miriam Elaine Cross of Greensboro, North Carolina. I said nothing. She said, I have been looking for you for 3 years and I did not recognize your name when you were admitted because I look after many patients and you arrived in an emergency and I was focused on your care. And then I started to know you and something in me started to recognize something that I did not have a name for, and then last week I was reviewing your intake paperwork for a medication update, and I saw your full name and your date of birth, and I sat at the nurse's station for a very long time before I came in to ask you this question. I looked at my daughter. I am going to say that plainly because she is my daughter and has been my daughter since before I knew she existed, since the moment I understood in 1978 that there was a person inside me who was not mine to keep, not because I did not want her, but because wanting something and being able to give it. What it needs are two different things, and at 24, I was not able to give her what she needed, and I knew it. And the knowing had been one of the defining griefs of my life for 50 years. I looked at my daughter, and my daughter looked at me, and I said, I have thought about you every day for 50 years. She said, I know. She said it with a certainty that surprised me. Not, I believe you or I believe that, but I know with the specific assurance of someone who has already done enough thinking about a thing to know what it contains. She said, I know because I have thought about you too. She said, the whole time I was growing up, when things were good with my adoptive family, and when they were hard, and when I was building my own life, there was always a question at the center of it that I could not get past. And the question was not why, not in the angry version, but something more. Like what happened? Who were you? What was your life? Were you okay? She said, I am a nurse because I wanted to be useful to people in the most direct way I could imagine, and I think some part of that came from the knowledge that somewhere there was a woman who had made a sacrifice and I wanted to honor it in the way I could, which was by being the kind of person who helped people in the way she had not had someone to help her. I cried. I do not cry easily, and I did not cry easily even then. But I cried in the way that crying comes when it has been held back for a very long time, and a holding back has exhausted itself, not a performance of grief, but grief itself, 50 years of a question I had never been able to resolve arriving. At its resolution in a bed in a care facility in Greensboro with my cast on my wrist and the light from the corridor coming under the door. Diane handed me a tissue and she waited and she did not try to manage the moment or steer it toward resolution before it had found its own shape. And I thought, even in the middle of the crying, that this quality of patience was the quality I had hoped she would have when I had thought about her, which I had done every April for 50 years on the anniversary of her birth, A day I had never been able to let pass unmarked even in the years when marking it had cost me something. She was the thing I had hoped she would be, not in the sense of the fantasy a person constructs over decades, which becomes so elaborate and so specific that the real person could never inhabit it, but in the sense of the essential thing, the quality underneath the specifics, the person who was inside the choice I made when she was not yet a person but was already somehow my daughter. She was kind. She was capable. She had built something real with her life. She was here. I want to tell you the weeks that followed without making them into a narrative tidier than they actually were, because the truth of a reunion after 50 years is not a Hallmark movie, and I do not think you are well served by my pretending it is. Diana had her own life, her own family, a husband named Michael, and 2 teenage children, her own history with her adoptive parents, one of whom was still living, and her own complicated relationship to the fact of her adoption and the question of her origins, a relationship she had been navigating for 3 years since she first accessed the records, and that my arrival in her care facility had accelerated dramatically. She was not angry at me. I want to say that because I think it is the thing most people are waiting to hear, whether the anger came, whether I had to earn something back, whether the reunion contained a reckoning. She had done the work, the therapy, and the reading and the looking that a person does when they are trying to understand something large that happened to them before they were old enough to have a say in it. And she had arrived, through that work, at a place where she understood the decision I had, made in 1978 not as abandonment, but as a specific act of a specific woman in specific circumstances, which is the only way that decision can be understood accurately. She was not angry. She was curious and warm, and she had questions that she asked over the weeks of my stay at Greenbrook, with the same careful patience she brought to everything, one at a time, leaving space between them, not demanding answers, but accepting them when they came. I told her about 1978 and the father of the child, a man I had been with briefly, who had not known about the pregnancy, and who I had not told because there was nothing he could have done that would have changed the situation, and I was not going to ask something of him that would have cost him more than he was equipped to give. I told her about Nathaniel, who had known about her from the beginning of our relationship because I had decided that he needed to know everything before we built something together, and who had held it with the specific gentleness of a man who understood that the things people carry before they come to you are not liabilities, but part of the whole of who they are, who had never once in 31 years made me feel that the April days were something to be hidden or managed or set aside, who had simply accepted them as part of the woman he had chosen, and who had sat with me on those April mornings sometimes, not always, but sometimes, quietly, without requiring me to explain why or to perform the grief in any particular way, just there, present, which had been one of the ways I had known that marrying him was right. I told her about the April days. She told me about growing up. She told me about her adoptive parents, a couple in Charlotte who had been good to her in the way that some adoptive parents are good to their children, fully and without reservation, who had told her from very young that she was adopted in the way that all adoption therapists recommend, as a simple fact rather than a secret, and who had supported her when she decided to look for her origins. She told me about nursing school and about Michael and about her children and about the specific satisfaction she found in her work, which she described as the satisfaction of being present at the moments when people are most themselves, stripped of the performances and the roles and the social furniture that people carry in ordinary life. And I thought about what she had said about making a sacrifice and honoring it, and I thought that she had done that in exactly the way she had intended. There were 2 things I needed to understand before I left Greenbrook, and I want to tell you about both of them. The first was how she had felt in the days between seeing my intake paperwork and coming to ask me the question. She told me she had sat with it for 5 days. She said she had not wanted to be wrong, had not wanted to build something on a name and a date of birth, only to find that the coincidence was a coincidence and not what it appeared to be, and that the 5 days had been the most suspended feeling she had experienced as an adult, the feeling of standing in a doorway not yet knowing which side of it she was on. She said she had also been afraid, not of the answer, not of me, but of the weight of what the answer would mean for both of us, the way that finding a person you have been looking for changes not just the future but the past, makes the past more present, gives it new dimensions, and that she had needed 5 days to decide she was ready to carry that weight. She said on the fifth night she had gone home and sat at her kitchen table after the children were in bed and told Michael about it, and he had said, "Diane, you already know you need to ask." And she had said yes, and he had said then ask. And she had come in the next evening and sat in the chair and asked. The second thing was Sandra. I had not spoken to Sandra in 2 months, and Sandra did not know where I was, and I had a choice to make about whether to change that, which is the sort of choice that looks simple from the outside and is not simple from the inside. And Diane, who had a particular gift for sitting with me in the middle of things that needed sitting in, talked with me about it over several evenings without telling me what to do because she understood that the doing needed to be mine. I called Sandra from my room at Greenbrook on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks into my stay. Sandra answered, and when I told her where I was, there was a silence that contained several things at once. The relief of knowing I was safe and cared for, the guilt of knowing what had preceded my being there, and the particular complicated emotion of a person who has done something she knows was wrong, and has been living with that knowledge without having had to confront it directly. I was not calling to confront her. I was calling because Diane had asked me, over one of our evenings, whether I wanted to carry this weight alone, or whether I thought there might be a version of my relationship with Sandra that was worth attempting to repair, and the question had sat with me for a week before I could answer it, and the answer I arrived at was that I did not know whether repair was possible, but I was not willing to close the door on it while the door could still be open, because I had seen what closed doors cost, and I was not going to choose that without exhausting the alternative. Sandra came to Greenbrook the following Saturday. She sat in the chair beside my bed where Diane had sat to ask me the question, and she looked at the cast on my wrist and at the room I had been living in for 6 weeks. And her face did several things that I let it do without managing them, because I had decided that my job in this conversation was to tell the truth and to receive the truth and to leave space for whatever happened between those two things to be what it was going to be. She said she was sorry. I said I believed her. She said she had been sorry since the night of the porch light and had not known how to say it and had been afraid to find me because finding me would require her to look directly at what she had done, and she was not sure she was capable of that, and she had been trying to become capable of it for 2 months. I said I understood that. I said, "Sandra, I am not without fault in what happened between us. I know how I say things, and I have known it for a long time, and knowing it is not the same as changing it, and I have work to do on that, same as you have work to do on yours." She cried. I held her hand. We were in my room at Greenbrook with the light coming through the window at the angle that had been a mercy from the beginning, and we were a mother and a daughter who had hurt each other, and were trying to see if there was a way to be a mother and a daughter still, and I did not know yet whether. There was, but I was willing to find out. When Sandra left that afternoon, I sat for a while alone, and then Diane came to do the evening check, and she looked at my face and said, "Your daughter was here." I said yes. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think we are going to be okay." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know, for what it's worth, I've thought about what you said, about every April." I said, "What about it?" She said, "Every April when I was growing up, I had a feeling I couldn't name. Not sad exactly, but like I was aware of something I couldn't see. Like a sound at a frequency that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears." She said, "I think I was feeling you thinking about me." I looked at my daughter. I said, "I think that is exactly right." I was discharged from Greenbrook 8 weeks after my admission with my wrist healed, and a plan that Diane and I had built together, quietly and carefully, over the course of those weeks. A plan that involved a small apartment, 20 minutes from Sandra and 30 minutes from Diane, close enough for both and independent enough for me. An arrangement I had the resources for, because I had been careful with money my whole life, and because Nathaniel had been careful with it too, and because the sale of the house on Callaway Street had left me with enough to choose, which is not nothing, and which I was grateful for in a way I had not been grateful for before, because I had not understood before what it meant to not have the choice. I want to tell you 2 things before I close this. The first is about Sandra, because I think she deserves more than the role of the person who put me on the street, which she was, and which was wrong, and which she has continued to reckon with in the months since, attending therapy for the first time in her adult life at the age of 47, calling me every Sunday morning without fail, coming to my apartment on the second Saturday of every month to have lunch and to stay for however long the staying is comfortable, which has gotten longer as the months have passed, and as we have learned to be with each other in a way that is more honest than the way we were before, which required the distance and the porch light and the fold-out sofa and birch view and the step in the kitchen and all of the rest of it in order to arrive at this particular honesty. She is my daughter, and she put me on the street, and she is also the woman who came to Greenbrook on a Saturday and cried and held my hand and said she was sorry and meant it with her jaw set and her full eyes and her whole self present, and the way that people are present when they are done performing and are just being themselves in a hard moment. And both of those things are true, and the truth of one does not cancel the truth of the other, which is the thing I keep learning and keep having to learn again about the people I love. The second is about Diane. We have dinner on the first Sunday of every month. Diane and Michael and their 2 children and me, at their house 20 minutes from my apartment, a house that is warm and a little loud with the specific energy of teenagers, and a husband who makes everyone laugh, and a woman who moves through her. Home with the same quality of presence she brings to her work, fully there, fully herself. Her children call me Grandma Miriam. They started it themselves without being asked, without being told that it was appropriate or expected or the right thing to do. They just started calling me Grandma Miriam because I was there, and I was their mother's mother, and the word fit, and so they used it, with the specific, uncomplicated naturalness of people who have not yet learned to make language harder than it needs to be. I am 74 years old, and I have a daughter I did not know and grandchildren who call me by name and a small apartment with a window that gets morning light and a Sunday phone call from Sandra and a son in Seattle who calls more often now than he used to, and a life that is not the life I had on Callaway Street, and not the life I had in Sandra's spare room, and not the life I had in Birchview, or on the fold-out sofa, or on the front step with the suitcase and the porch light going off. It is a different life. It is mine. And the shape of it, the particular unexpected shape of it, is something I could not have drawn for you 2 years ago, could not have imagined or predicted or hoped for in any specific way, which is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you, which is that the life you are going to live is not necessarily the one you can see from where you are standing, and that sometimes the thing that unmakes everything you thought you had is also the thing that leads you to the thing you did not know to look for. I sat on a front step with a suitcase at 72 years old. I found my daughter in a care facility at 74. Both of those things happened. They happened to the same woman in the same life. The life I have been living. The life that continues. The life whose next chapter I cannot yet see and am no longer afraid to meet. Thank you for being here until the end of this. If this story reached something real in you, leave it in the comments. Tell me what it touched. Tell me about the thing in your life that unmade one version so that another could begin. Because I believe in those stories, and I believe in the telling of them, and I believe you are not alone in quote, whatever yours contains. Subscribe if you have not, and share this with someone who needs it, and I will see you next time.